The year was 1792, and the streets of Paris ran crimson with the blood of revolution. In the shadow of the guillotine's relentless blade, where mercy had become a forgotten virtue and violence the new religion, one execution would stand apart from all others. Not for its method, but for its unspeakable savagery. What happened to Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, known as the Princess de Lamballe, on September 3rd of that year would shock even the most hardened revolutionaries who witnessed it. This wasn't merely another aristocrat meeting their end during France's bloodiest chapter. This was something far more sinister. A calculated act of psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of an imprisoned queen and demonstrate the revolution's capacity for cruelty that defied all human decency. The Princess de Lamballe was no ordinary victim of revolutionary justice. She was the dearest friend of Marie Antoinette, a woman whose unwavering loyalty would ultimately cost her everything. Today, we're going to uncover the horrifying truth about what really happened during those final hours. And I must warn you, what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the French Revolution's capacity for brutality. This isn't just a story of political upheaval or class warfare. This is a story about how quickly civilization can collapse into barbarism and how the noblest human qualities can become death sentences when fear and hatred take hold. To understand the full horror of what befell the Princess de Lamballe, we must first understand who she was and how she found herself trapped in the revolutionary nightmare that would consume her. Born into the noble house of Savoy in 1749, Marie-Thérèse Louise entered a world of privilege that would soon become her prison. At 17, she was married to Louis-Alexandre de Bourbon, Prince de Lamballe, in what was nothing more than a political arrangement between powerful families. The marriage was doomed from the start. Her husband was known throughout the French court for his dissolute lifestyle, his gambling debts, and his numerous affairs. For a young woman who possessed both sensitivity and deep religious conviction, this union was a source of profound unhappiness, but fate would intervene in the cruelest way possible. Just 1 year after their marriage, in May of 1768, the Prince de Lamballe died suddenly, possibly from syphilis contracted through his promiscuous behavior. At 18 years old, Marie-Thérèse found herself a widow, devastated and alone in the treacherous world of French court politics. But rather than retreat from public life or seek another advantageous marriage, she made a decision that would define the rest of her existence. She chose to dedicate herself to service and friendship, transforming her grief into compassion for others who suffered as she had suffered. It was this transformation that would bring her into the orbit of another young woman struggling with the pressures of royal life. Marie Antoinette had arrived at Versailles from Austria, homesick and struggling to adapt to French customs and expectations. The two women found in each other kindred spirits who understood the profound loneliness that could exist even in the grandest palaces. Their friendship was genuine and deep, built on shared experiences of loss, displacement, and the suffocating weight of court expectations. The Princess de Lamballe provided the emotional support and unwavering loyalty that the future queen desperately needed, while finding her own purpose in this devoted service to someone who truly valued her presence. When Marie Antoinette ascended to the throne in 1774, she created a special position for her dear friend, appointing her superintendent of the household. This role came with significant influence and a generous annual salary of 150,000 livres. But what seemed like a blessing would ultimately become a curse, elevating the Princess de Lamballe to unprecedented power for a woman at court, while simultaneously making her a target for those who resented the Queen's Austrian origins and perceived extravagances. As criticism of the royal family's lifestyle mounted throughout the 1770s and 1780s, the Princess de Lamballe found herself increasingly in the crosshairs of public resentment. Pamphlets and broadsheets began circulating throughout Paris, painting her as a corrupting influence who encouraged the Queen's supposed excesses and foreign sympathies. The revolutionary press portrayed her as a symbol of everything wrong with the old regime: foreign influence, aristocratic privilege, and blind loyalty to a monarchy that many French citizens had grown to despise. Despite the growing hostility and the very real danger it represented, the Princess de Lamballe never wavered in her devotion to Marie Antoinette. She understood better than most that her position made her vulnerable to attack, but she also recognized that the Queen needed her friendship more than ever as France's political situation deteriorated with each passing month. The princess had witnessed firsthand the Queen's struggles, her difficulties with motherhood, her husband's initial coldness, and the relentless criticism that seemed to follow her every move. She saw how the weight of crown and country was crushing the spirit of a woman who had never asked for such burdens. This deep understanding of the Queen's suffering only strengthened her resolve to remain steadfast, regardless of the personal cost. When the revolution erupted in 1789 like a powder keg that had been building pressure for decades, the Princess de Lamballe found herself facing an impossible choice. Friends and advisors urged her to flee France while she still could, to seek safety in the courts of Europe, where her noble birth would be protection rather than liability. They warned her that her close association with Marie Antoinette made her a prime target for revolutionary justice, that staying would mean certain death. But for a woman who had defined herself through loyalty and service, there was really no choice at all. She would stand by her friend, regardless of the consequences, fully understanding what that decision might cost her. This wasn't a choice made lightly or impulsively. The princess understood the risks better than most, having witnessed the revolutionary crowd's capacity for violence and having read the increasingly vicious attacks on the royal family in the revolutionary press. Her decision to remain was influenced by her deep religious faith, which taught her that earthly suffering was temporary while honor and duty were eternal. She believed that abandoning Marie Antoinette in her hour of greatest need would be a betrayal of everything she stood for, a violation of sacred bonds that transcended political upheaval. As 1792 dawned, the princess could see that the situation was rapidly becoming untenable. The royal family had been transferred from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where they lived under virtual house arrest. Revolutionary sentiment was reaching fever pitch, and calls for the complete abolition of the monarchy grew louder with each passing day. The war that France declared against Austria and Prussia in April 1792 only intensified the revolutionary fervor and suspicion of anyone with aristocratic connections. The Princess de Lamballe, with her foreign birth and royal associations, was increasingly seen as a potential traitor who might be working with France's enemies. By summer, radical Jacobins had gained control of the revolutionary government, and their rhetoric had turned violently toward all perceived enemies of the Republic. The concept of mercy or moderation had been abandoned in favor of what they called revolutionary justice, a euphemism for the systematic elimination of anyone deemed a threat to the new order. The princess's final test came in August 1792, when revolutionary forces stormed the Tuileries Palace in a bloodbath that would seal the fate of the monarchy forever. The Swiss guards who had been protecting the royal family were massacred without mercy, their bodies left to rot in the palace courtyards as a warning to anyone who dared defend the crown. The king and queen were arrested and dragged to the Temple Tower, where they would await their eventual trials and executions. In the chaos that followed, the Princess de Lamballe could have claimed diplomatic immunity. Her noble birth and international connections might have provided an escape route that others lacked. Foreign ambassadors stood ready to whisk her away to safety in the courts of Europe, where she would have been welcomed with open arms and protected from the revolutionary madness consuming France. But she made a choice that would define her legacy for centuries to come. Instead of fleeing to safety, she chose to share the fate of her beloved friend. On August 19, 1792, the Princess de Lamballe was arrested and taken to La Force prison, one of the most notorious detention facilities in revolutionary Paris. This wasn't merely imprisonment, it was a deliberate descent into hell. La Force was overcrowded, filthy, and deliberately designed to break the spirits of those confined within its walls. The princess found herself crammed into a cell with common criminals, denied adequate food and sanitation, subjected to constant verbal abuse from guards who took pleasure in tormenting their aristocratic prisoners. The revolutionaries hoped these degrading conditions would force her to renounce her royalist beliefs and provide testimony against Marie Antoinette. They had gravely underestimated the strength of her convictions. Despite the physical and psychological pressure, despite the rats and the filth and the constant threat of violence, the Princess de Lamballe refused to compromise her principles. She spent her days in prayer and meditation, drawing strength from her faith and her unwavering belief that she was suffering for a just cause. Fellow prisoners later testified to her remarkable composure during these hellish weeks. Even in the depths of revolutionary prison, she maintained her dignity and kindness, sharing what little food she received, and providing comfort to other inmates who were struggling with their circumstances. Her steadfast refusal to cooperate with her captors only increased their frustration and rage. Revolutionary officials had hoped to use her testimony to build a stronger case against Marie Antoinette, but her unwavering loyalty made her useless as a witness for the prosecution. Instead, she became a symbol of aristocratic defiance that needed to be broken to demonstrate the power and determination of the revolutionary government. Every day that she held firm was another day that her captor's authority was challenged by her mere existence. As the weeks passed in La Force prison, the princess must have sensed that something terrible was approaching. The atmosphere in Paris had grown increasingly toxic, with radical newspapers calling for the blood of all enemies of the revolution. Speakers in the clubs and assemblies whipped crowds into frenzies of hatred, convincing ordinary citizens that extraordinary measures were necessary to save the Republic from its enemies. The September Massacres began on September 2nd, 1792, following news that enemy armies were advancing on Paris and wild rumors that imprisoned nobles and priests were planning to escape and join the invaders. Radical leaders like Jean-Paul Marat and Georges Danton seized upon this paranoia, convincing the population that the prisoners represented a mortal threat to the revolution that could only be eliminated through immediate and decisive action. What followed was 5 days of systematic slaughter that claimed over 1,000 lives across Paris. But these weren't random acts of violence committed by criminals or outcasts. The mobs that carried out these killings were composed of ordinary Parisians, shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers who had been convinced that their revolution was in mortal danger and that the prisoners they were murdering deserved death for their crimes against the people. This transformation of neighbors into executioners was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the September Massacres. It revealed how quickly civilization could collapse when fear, hatred, and mob mentality were given free rein. The revolutionaries had created a perfect storm of paranoia and bloodlust that would consume not just their enemies, but ultimately many of their own leaders as well. On September 3rd, the mob's attention turned to La Force prison, where word had spread that the Queen's closest friend was being held. The crowd had worked itself into a fury over her symbolic importance. She represented everything they had been taught to hate about the old regime: foreign influence, aristocratic privilege, and unwavering loyalty to a monarchy they were desperately trying to destroy. The princess was dragged from her cell and brought before a makeshift tribunal that had been established in the prison courtyard. This wasn't a legal proceeding in any meaningful sense, but rather a piece of revolutionary theatre designed to provide a thin veneer of justice to what was essentially a predetermined lynching. The judges were members of the mob itself, drunk on power and bloodlust, who had already decided her fate before she appeared before them. The tribunal's questions were perfunctory and designed to trap rather than enlighten. They demanded that the princess swear an oath denouncing the monarchy and declaring her loyalty to the Republic. They wanted her to condemn Marie Antoinette as an enemy of the people and provide testimony that could be used in the Queen's eventual trial. Most importantly, they wanted her public submission. her acknowledgement that the old order was dead, and that the revolution had triumphed over all opposition. The Princess de Lamballe's response was characteristic of the extraordinary courage and dignity she had shown throughout her ordeal. Standing before this howling mob of would-be executioners, she calmly but firmly refused to take any oath against the monarchy or say anything that might harm Marie Antoinette. She acknowledged that she could not swear loyalty to principles she did not believe in, and she expressed her willingness to accept whatever punishment the tribunal might impose upon her. Her composure in the face of certain death impressed even some of her enemies, but it only enraged the mob further. They had wanted her humiliation and submission, but her dignified defiance challenged their authority and questioned the legitimacy of their revolutionary justice. Someone in the crowd shouted the words that would seal her fate: "Death to the friend of Antoinette." And within moments, the princess was being dragged from the tribunal toward an end more horrific than anything she could have imagined. What happened next would become one of the most shocking examples of mob violence in human history, an act so brutal and depraved that it would haunt the memories of witnesses for decades to come. The princess was forced to run a gauntlet of enraged attackers who had armed themselves with clubs, stones, and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. But this wasn't a quick execution meant to end her life swiftly. The mob had something far more sinister in mind. They wanted to extract every possible moment of terror and humiliation from her death, to transform her final moments into a spectacle that would serve as both entertainment and warning. Contemporary witnesses described how she was stripped of her clothing and subjected to unspeakable violations before the killing even began. Her suffering was deliberately prolonged as the crowd took turns inflicting pain and degradation upon her body. The brutality wasn't incidental to their purpose, it was the purpose itself. They had transformed murder into a ritualistic celebration of their revolutionary power. What made this execution particularly horrifying wasn't just its savage nature, but the calculated psychology behind it. The revolutionaries understood that Marie Antoinette would learn of her friend's fate, and they wanted to ensure that the Queen grasped exactly what awaited anyone who remained loyal to the monarchy. The princess's death was intended as both revenge and warning, a demonstration of the revolution's power to destroy not just its enemies' lives, but their very humanity. The manner of her death defied every convention of civilized society and shocked observers across Europe who had thought they understood the depths of revolutionary violence. She wasn't simply killed, but systematically tortured and mutilated in ways that were designed to deny her even the basic dignity that should accompany death. The mob's actions revealed how completely moral restraints had been abandoned when violence became a form of political expression. But the horror didn't end with the princess's death. In an act of unprecedented barbarity, the crowd decapitated her corpse and mounted her severed head on a pike. Contemporary witnesses described how they then began a grotesque procession through the streets of Paris, carrying the head like a trophy while chanting revolutionary songs and celebrating their victory over aristocratic tyranny. The mob's bloodlust was far from satisfied by simply ending her life. They subjected her body to further mutilation, cutting it into pieces that were distributed among the crowd as grisly souvenirs. Some accounts describe how her heart was torn from her chest and consumed by members of the mob. Though these reports may represent the kind of mythologizing that often surrounds particularly shocking historical events, what cannot be disputed is that her remains were treated with a savagery that horrified even contemporary observers who had grown accustomed to revolutionary violence. The very people who had spent years calling for liberty, equality, and fraternity had transformed themselves into something that resembled the worst excesses of medieval barbarism. The severed head of the Princess de Lamballe became the centerpiece of a macabre parade that wound its way through the streets of Paris toward the Temple Tower, where Marie Antoinette was imprisoned. The mob was determined to ensure that the Queen witnessed what had become of her dearest friend. and they took deliberate steps to make the head recognizable despite the violence it had endured. Witnesses described how they had carefully styled the princess's hair and applied rouge to her cheeks, creating a horrifying parody of her former beauty. This wasn't random violence or spontaneous brutality. It was a carefully orchestrated piece of psychological warfare designed to inflict maximum trauma on their ultimate target. The procession to the temple represented the revolution at its most calculating and cruel. The revolutionaries had learned that physical torture alone was insufficient to break their enemies' spirits. They needed to destroy hope, love, and human connection itself. By forcing Marie Antoinette to confront the mutilated remains of her closest friend, they were attacking not just her body, but her very soul. When the howling mob reached the temple tower, they began screaming demands that the guards force Marie Antoinette to look out her window at the princess's severed head. The queen initially refused, understanding instinctively what this grotesque display was meant to accomplish. But the crowd's threats became so violent and persistent that she was eventually compelled to witness the horrifying spectacle that awaited her. Contemporary accounts describe how she collapsed upon seeing what had become of the woman who had been closer to her than a sister. The sight of her friend's mutilated head, decorated with rouge and mounted on a pike like some medieval battle trophy, shattered whatever emotional reserves she had managed to maintain during her imprisonment. The psychological impact of this forced viewing cannot be overstated. Marie Antoinette had already endured the loss of her throne, her freedom, and her way of life. She had watched helplessly as her husband was stripped of his authority, and their children were subjected to revolutionary propaganda. But the sight of her dearest friend's severed head represented a new level of cruelty that destroyed whatever hope she might have retained. The revolutionaries had succeeded in their goal of breaking her spirit completely. They had demonstrated that they could reach her loved ones even in death and subject them to unimaginable degradation. The message was clear: no one who opposed the revolution would be spared, and no loyalty would be rewarded except loyalty to the new order. The mob celebration continued for hours after the princess's death, with crowds gathering in taverns and public squares throughout Paris to drink and carouse in honor of their triumph. The severed head was carried from place to place like a sacred relic, with different groups taking turns displaying it and recounting increasingly embellished details of the execution. This communal celebration of violence revealed how thoroughly the revolution had corrupted normal human emotions and social bonds. Murder had become entertainment, cruelty had been transformed into virtue, and the most basic human decency had been sacrificed on the altar of political ideology. The ordinary citizens of Paris had been transformed into something unrecognizable, creatures capable of finding joy in the systematic destruction of another human being. The treatment of the princess's remains also reflected the revolutionaries' desire to erase not just their enemies' lives, but their very memory and meaning. By denying her a proper burial and distributing her body parts as trophies, they were attempting to prevent her from becoming a martyr or symbol of resistance. They wanted her death to serve as pure intimidation rather than inspiration. Yet in their very excess, they had created something they hadn't intended. The shocking brutality of her execution began to turn even some revolutionary sympathizers against the movement. Reports of what had happened to the gentle princess, who had never harmed anyone and whose only crime was loyalty to a friend, began to circulate throughout Europe with devastating effect. The international reaction was one of horror and revulsion that would have profound consequences for revolutionary France. European courts, already alarmed by the revolution's excesses, saw in the princess's death definitive proof that France had descended into complete barbarism. The detailed accounts that spread across the continent served to harden international opinion against the revolutionary government and contributed to the formation of military coalitions that would wage war against France for decades to come. Even within France itself, many moderate revolutionaries were deeply disturbed by the brutality of what had occurred. The princess's execution marked a turning point that demonstrated the radical factions were willing to embrace any level of violence to achieve their goals. This realization would contribute to the factional struggles that would eventually consume many of the revolution's own leaders, as each group sought to prove its revolutionary purity through increasingly extreme acts. The death of the Princess de Lamballe thus became both a symbol of revolutionary triumph and a harbinger of the self-destructive tendencies that would eventually transform the revolution into something its original architects never intended. In trying to create a perfect society through violence, they had unleashed forces that would ultimately devour the revolution itself. The execution had immediate and devastating consequences for the royal family imprisoned in the Temple Tower. Marie Antoinette's physical and mental health deteriorated rapidly after witnessing her friend's death, and she never recovered from the psychological trauma of that September afternoon. The king, too, was profoundly affected by the loss of a woman he had known and respected for decades, while their children were traumatized by their parents' visible grief and by the knowledge that such violence could reach even those they held most dear. The revolutionary government's response to the princess's execution revealed the depths of their calculated cruelty. Rather than expressing any regret or attempting to distance themselves from the mob's actions, radical leaders like Jean-Paul Marat openly celebrated what had occurred as necessary revolutionary justice. They proclaimed that the princess's loyalty to the monarchy made her a traitor to the people, and that her death served as a proper warning to anyone who might consider opposing their cause. This official endorsement of extreme violence marked a fundamental transformation in the revolution's character. What had begun as a movement seeking political reform and social justice had mutated into something far more sinister. The revolutionaries had created a system that justified any level of brutality in service of ideological goals, abandoning their original principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity in favor of pure terror. The propaganda machinery immediately seized upon the princess's death for maximum political impact. For the radicals, her execution demonstrated their absolute power and unwavering resolve. They had proven that no enemy of the people was beyond their reach, regardless of a noble birth or international connections. The message resonated through every prison cell and aristocratic drawing room that remained in France. For the counter-revolutionaries, however, the princess's martyrdom became an equally powerful symbol of the revolution's moral bankruptcy. Her story spread through underground networks and émigré communities across Europe, where it was retold as evidence of the revolution's descent into godless barbarism. These competing narratives would shape French political discourse for generations to come. The diplomatic consequences extended far beyond France's borders. European monarchs, already deeply concerned about the revolutionary threat to royal authority, interpreted the princess's brutal death as definitive proof that no accommodation with the revolutionary government was possible. Her murder, combined with the hundreds of other nobles and clergy slaughtered during the September Massacres, convinced foreign powers that military intervention was their only option. The execution also established a terrifying precedent for the revolution's treatment of women associated with the old regime. The princess's death demonstrated that the revolution's proclaimed ideals of equality offered no protection from violence, and that aristocratic women could expect no mercy from revolutionary justice. This realization prompted a mass exodus of noble families, with many women choosing exile over the risk of suffering a similar fate. The psychological warfare tactics pioneered during the princess's execution became standard tools of revolutionary justice throughout the Terror. The deliberate infliction of mental torture, the weaponization of loved ones' deaths against surviving prisoners, and the public celebration of violence all became integral components of the revolutionary state's apparatus of control. The economic ramifications proved equally devastating for revolutionary France. The shocking brutality drove away foreign investment, disrupted established trade relationships, and contributed to the diplomatic isolation that would plague the country for years. The princess's death, as one of the most internationally notorious incidents of the period, played a crucial role in damaging France's reputation and economic prospects on the world stage. Beyond its immediate political impact, the princess's execution left an indelible mark on European culture and consciousness. Her story inspired countless works of literature, art, and drama, serving as a powerful symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and the human cost of political extremism. Writers across the continent used her death as a cautionary tale about how quickly civilization could collapse into barbarism. The romantic martyrology that developed around her figure, while perhaps historically embellished in some details, served important cultural functions. It provided a counter-narrative to revolutionary propaganda and preserved alternative values during periods of radical transformation. Her story became a touchstone for those who believed that some principles were worth dying for, regardless of political circumstances. In the broader context of revolutionary violence, the Princess de Lamballe's death stands uniquely horrifying for both its savage brutality and its symbolic resonance. While thousands perished during the Terror, her execution captured public imagination because it combined extreme physical violence with a compelling narrative of friendship and unwavering loyalty. Her death became a lens through which people could process the larger trauma of revolutionary upheaval. The horrifying death of Princess de Lamballe forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the fragility of civilization itself. Her execution wasn't simply the murder of one woman, but the deliberate destruction of everything noble about friendship, loyalty, and human decency. In choosing to remain faithful to Marie Antoinette even unto death, she affirmed values that transcend political movements and historical moments. Her story reminds us that the liberties we take for granted were purchased with blood and suffering, and that the choice between freedom and security is one each generation must make anew. The princess died as she had lived, true to her principles and devoted to those she loved, proving that even in history's darkest hours, the human spirit can shine with remarkable brilliance.